The Wild West would have killed you. The brutal truth. Think you could survive the Wild West? Stop right there. Forget everything Hollywood has ever shown you about heroic cowboys, dramatic high-noon shootouts, and noble frontier life. The real American frontier of the 1870s was a meat grinder that would have chewed you up and spat you out before you made it through your first day. Today, we're going on a journey back to the actual Wild West. Not the sanitized, romanticized version you've seen in movies, but the grim, unforgiving reality where survival was never guaranteed and death was everyone's constant companion. By the end of this deep dive, you'll understand why the average modern person wouldn't last 24 hours in the conditions that defined America's frontier period. So settle in, because we're about to destroy every myth you've ever believed about the Wild West and replace them with the terrifying truth that Hollywood never wanted you to see. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the American frontier of 1875. The good news, you're about to experience one of the most legendary periods in American history firsthand. The bad news, your chances of seeing tomorrow just dropped to almost zero. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight of the rugged landscape or the sound of spurs jingling down dusty streets. It's the smell. And trust me, it's a smell that would make a modern person immediately vomit. We're talking about the combined stench of unwashed human bodies, animal droppings piled knee-deep in heavily trafficked areas, and what might charitably be called raw sewage hanging thick in the air like a toxic fog. You see, bathing wasn't exactly a priority in the Wild West. Most settlers considered a thorough wash a monthly luxury, and that's being generous. Some people went entire winters without a proper bath because water was precious, and using it to clean yourself seemed wasteful when you needed every drop for drinking and cooking. The result was a population that would clear out a modern elevator in seconds. As you drag yourself from your bed, and I use that term loosely since you're probably lying on a straw-filled mattress that's crawling with bed bugs, fleas, and God knows what else, you realize that every single muscle in your body is screaming in agony. This isn't the pleasant soreness from a good workout. This is the bone-deep ache that comes from 14 hours of back-breaking physical labor, day after day, with no relief in sight. Life in the 1870s frontier meant constant physical work from dawn until well after dusk. There were no weekends off, no vacation days, no sick leave, and absolutely no ergonomic considerations. Whether you were a farmer breaking prairie sod that was tough as concrete, a miner hauling ore out of dangerous shafts, or a ranch hand wrestling with 1,500-pound cattle, your body was your primary tool. And like any tool in the frontier, it was used until it broke down completely. The work was so physically demanding that it permanently damaged most people's bodies. Farmers in their 30s were often permanently hunched from years of plowing. Miners developed chronic respiratory problems from inhaling rock dust. Ranch hands suffered countless broken bones and joint problems from being thrown by horses or trampled by cattle. The average lifespan on the frontier was only about 35 years, and those who lived longer usually carried the physical scars of their survival. Standing on your cabin's dirt floor, because wooden floors were a luxury most couldn't afford, you notice the bone-chilling cold if it's winter. Your cabin might be 20 degrees below freezing inside, even with a fireplace, because you had to let the fire burn down overnight to conserve precious fuel. Good luck finding central heating or insulated underwear in 1875. And if it's summer, prepare to sweat through every piece of clothing you own, which probably consists of 2 sets total if you're lucky. Speaking of clothing, forget any notion of comfort. Men typically owned maybe 2 sets of rough canvas or denim pants and cotton shirts that chafed against the skin like sandpaper. Women were trapped in multiple layers regardless of temperature. Chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that dragged in the dirt and collected filth. Everything was scratchy, ill-fitting, and rarely cleaned because washing clothes was an exhausting, time-consuming process that required hauling and heating massive amounts of water. Those fancy, well-tailored outfits you've seen in Western movies? Pure Hollywood fiction. The average frontier person looked more like a scarecrow than a fashion plate. Your stomach starts growling, reminding you that it's time for breakfast. Hope you like beans, biscuits, and coffee, because you're going to be eating them for every meal. The Wild West diet was monotonous, nutritionally deficient, and frankly, dangerous. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries that most people saw maybe a few months out of the year. Meat, when it was available, was often preserved with so much salt it could strip paint or smoked until it had the texture of leather. This was necessary because refrigeration didn't exist. Everything had to be preserved through methods that often made the food barely edible, but technically safe to consume. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that makes your gums bleed and your teeth fall out, was incredibly common among frontier settlers. This is particularly tragic because scurvy is easily preventable with basic nutrition knowledge, but that knowledge simply didn't exist in most frontier communities. And that coffee you're desperately hoping will help you face the day? Don't get your hopes up. Frontier coffee was typically boiled until it was bitter beyond belief, and might include crushed eggshells, salt, or other additives to try to cut the bitterness. It barely resembled what we'd recognize as coffee today, but the caffeine was sometimes the only thing that kept people going through another grueling day. Before you even think about stepping outside, you'd better shake out your boots and check every piece of clothing carefully. Scorpions, rattlesnakes, and other venomous creatures regularly sought shelter in warm, dark places, like inside boots, under blankets, or in clothing piles. It wasn't uncommon for frontier people to start each day by shaking out their possessions, a habit born from painful and sometimes fatal experience. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and you could be facing a venomous bite miles away from any medical help. And as we'll discuss later, medical help in the frontier was often worse than no help at all. Step outside your cabin and you're immediately struck by how utterly exposed and vulnerable you are. The landscape of the American frontier was breathtaking, sure, but it was also completely unforgiving. Extreme weather could appear with absolutely no warning, and when it hit, it could kill the unprepared in minutes. Blizzards could strand travelers, leading to deaths from exposure. Tornadoes could destroy entire communities with no emergency services to help survivors dig out. Flash floods could wash away wagon trains, drowning entire families. Droughts could ruin crops and cause widespread starvation. The weather wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a constant threat to your existence. If you were lucky enough to live in a frontier town instead of an isolated homestead, you might think civilization would offer some protection. In some ways, you'd be right. In others, towns just presented different and sometimes worse dangers. Frontier towns were absolute hotbeds of disease. Without proper sewage systems or any understanding of germ theory, illnesses spread through communities like wildfire. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were constant threats that could wipe out half a town's population in a matter of weeks. Picture this. Someone in your town gets sick on Monday. By Wednesday, a dozen people are showing symptoms. By the following Monday, half the town is dead or dying, and there's absolutely nothing anyone can do to stop it. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a regular feature of frontier life. The towns themselves were often poorly planned, if planned at all. Many Western settlements grew haphazardly, with buildings constructed wherever it was convenient, often without any infrastructure. Streets weren't paved. They were dirt tracks that turned into muddy swamps when it rained, and dust bowls when it was dry. The smell in towns was even worse than on isolated homesteads. Horse manure was everywhere because horses were the primary means of transportation, and there were no street cleaners or sanitation departments. In some frontier towns, the accumulated animal waste could be knee-deep in heavily trafficked areas. Flies swarmed everywhere, and you quickly realized why disease spread so easily in these communities. As you walk down what passes for a main street, you'll pass the local saloon, which was likely one of the busiest establishments in town. But forget the glamorous establishments with swinging doors and piano players that you've seen in movies. Most frontier saloons were crude, one-room affairs with rough wooden bars and basic furniture. The alcohol served wasn't fine whiskey aged in oak barrels. It was raw alcohol often mixed with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it an extra kick. A single drink from some of these establishments could literally blind you if you were unlucky enough to get a bad batch. These saloons represented another deadly aspect of frontier life, violence, but not the romanticized violence of Hollywood westerns. We're talking about drunken arguments that escalated quickly in a heavily armed society where impulse control was often the only thing standing between disagreement and death. The romanticized gunfights of Western movies, those formal duels with men facing off at high noon, were extremely rare. Most frontier violence was impulsive, messy, and brutally unfair. Someone would get drunk, take offense at something trivial, and before you knew it, people were dead over disputes that any reasonable person would forget about in 5 minutes. You might be surprised to learn that many frontier towns actually had strict gun control laws. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to surrender their firearms when entering the town limits. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral actually started because the Clanton gang refused to comply with Tombstone's weapons ordinance. The constant threat from wild animals, bears, wolves, mountain lions, and venomous snakes, made going completely unarmed foolish, especially when traveling between settlements. But the image of everyone walking around armed to the teeth, ready for gunfights, is largely a Hollywood invention. When violence did occur, it was typically sudden and chaotic. Most shootings were ambushes or happened during robberies. The skilled gunslinger facing off against an opponent in a fair fight is largely fictional. Real frontier violence was usually cowardly, unexpected, and completely lacking in any sense of honor or fairness. If the environment, disease, and violence don't get you, don't worry. The medical care definitely will. Frontier medical treatment in the 1870s would absolutely horrify anyone with modern sensibilities. Most frontier communities had no doctors at all, and those that did often had practitioners with minimal training, maybe a brief apprenticeship or a few months at a medical college. The medical knowledge of the era was primitive at best and actively harmful at worst. Doctors still believed in theories like humoral balance that had more in common with medieval medicine than anything we'd recognize as legitimate medical practice. Common treatments included bloodletting, which weakened already sick patients by draining their blood. Purgatives caused severe diarrhea, supposedly to expel bad humors from the body. Poultices made from various substances were applied to wounds, often introducing infection rather than preventing it. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely used for pain relief, leading to widespread addiction. Mercury compounds were prescribed for numerous conditions despite being highly toxic. Even when treatments had some validity, impure medications often caused more problems than they solved. Surgery in frontier conditions was particularly nightmarish. Without effective anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium, patients endured excruciating pain during procedures. Sterilization was unknown or inconsistently practiced, leading to rampant post-surgical infections. Amputation was the standard treatment for serious limb injuries, performed with saws and knives that might be wiped clean, but were never properly sterilized. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Women typically gave birth at home, attended by a midwife if they were lucky, or just female relatives if they weren't. Without prenatal care, complications often weren't identified until labor was already underway. Breech births, hemorrhaging, and other emergencies that modern medicine handles routinely often resulted in the death of the mother, child, or both. The maternal mortality rate on the frontier was approximately 1 death per 100 births, more than 100 times higher than in developed countries today. Many women approached each pregnancy, knowing it might be their last experience in life. Men's diaries from the period frequently mention the heartbreaking reality of raising children alone after losing wives in childbirth. Even if you survived your immediate medical crisis, the long-term effects of frontier medicine were often devastating. The combination of inadequate nutrition, constant physical strain, minimal preventive care, and primitive treatment meant that frontier populations experienced health outcomes more similar to developing nations today than to modern America. Life expectancy at birth was under 40 years, and those who survived childhood were likely to suffer from chronic health problems by their 50s if they lived that long. The human cost of frontier expansion was measured not just in dramatic deaths from violence or accidents, but in the slow grinding down of bodies that simply couldn't withstand the relentless demands placed on them. This is just the beginning of your first day in the Wild West, and already the challenges are overwhelming. The simple act of waking up, eating breakfast, and walking outside has presented you with more potential ways to die than most modern people face in a year. And we haven't even gotten to the real dangers yet, the ones that defined frontier life and killed the majority of people who attempted to make a living in the American West. The reality is that the Wild West wasn't a place where heroes were made through courage and quick draws. It was a place where ordinary people faced extraordinary hardships with limited resources and knowledge, and most of them didn't make it out alive. The ones who did survive weren't necessarily the bravest or the most skilled. Often, they were simply the luckiest. Let's say you've somehow survived your first night in the frontier and decide you need to travel somewhere. Maybe you're joining a wagon train heading west, or just trying to get to the next town over. Either way, you're about to discover that transportation in the 1870s was less romantic adventure and more elaborate suicide attempt. The good news is that by the 1870s, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, connecting the east and west coasts. The bad news? Unless you were relatively wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford to use it. Most frontier folks traveled by horse, wagon, or simply on foot. Even if you could afford train travel, it wasn't the comfortable experience you might imagine. Early railroad cars were basically wooden boxes on wheels with minimal padding and no climate control. In summer, you'd roast like a turkey in an oven. In winter, you'd freeze despite the small, inadequate heating stoves that filled the cars with smoke and the constant risk of fire. Railroad accidents were horrifically common. Trains derailed regularly, often at high speeds, sending passengers flying through wooden cars that splintered like kindling. Boiler explosions could turn a locomotive into a bomb, killing everyone within hundreds of feet. Bridge collapses dumped entire trains into rivers and canyons. But let's be honest, most frontier people never saw the inside of a train car. They traveled the old-fashioned way, which is to say the incredibly dangerous way. If you owned a horse, you were relatively fortunate. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, often costing several months' wages for an average worker. But even if you could afford one, horse travel was far from the romantic image portrayed in movies. First, the saddles weren't designed for comfort, but for function. Hours in a 1870s, saddle would leave even experienced riders with blisters, sores, and aching muscles. The constant jarring motion could cause serious spinal problems over time, and that's assuming your horse didn't suddenly decide to throw you off. Horses spooked at everything: snakes, sudden noises, unfamiliar objects, changes in weather. When a 1,200-pound animal panics while you're on its back, you're going to have a very bad day. Being thrown from a horse could easily result in broken bones, head injuries, or death, especially when you're miles from any help. And horses themselves were fragile. A horse that stepped in a prairie dog hole could break a leg, which was essentially a death sentence for both the animal and potentially its rider, who might be stranded in the wilderness without transportation. Horses could also die from colic, eating poisonous plants, or simply from the stress and poor nutrition of frontier conditions. Even if your horse stayed healthy, you had to constantly worry about horse thieves. Stealing horses was considered one of the most serious crimes on the frontier, often punishable by hanging, because it literally meant condemning the victim to death by stranding them in hostile territory. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might travel by wagon. Forget any romantic notions you have about pioneering families cheerfully rolling across pristine prairies. Wagon travel was an exercise in sustained torture that would break most modern people within days. The wagons had no suspension system beyond the slight give in wooden wheels, meaning you felt every single rock, rut, and hole in your path. The constant jarring was so severe, it caused a condition called wagon sickness, similar to seasickness, that left travelers nauseous and miserable for the entire journey. Roads, when they existed at all, were just dirt tracks carved by previous travelers. After rain, they became muddy quagmires where wagons could sink axle deep and become completely immobilized. During dry periods, the dust was so thick you could barely breathe or see. Many travelers wrapped cloth around their faces, but fine dust still penetrated everything, coating your food, water, and lungs. Wagons broke down constantly. Wheels cracked, axles snapped, and canvas covers tore in the wind. When this happened, miles from the nearest settlement, you had to repair everything yourself with whatever materials you had on hand, or abandon your possessions and continue on foot. Loading and unloading wagons was backbreaking work. Every river crossing, every steep hill, every muddy section meant unloading hundreds of pounds of supplies, manhandling the wagon through the obstacle, then reloading everything. Women and children participated in this grueling labor alongside men, often working until they collapsed from exhaustion. The most infamous wagon route was the Oregon Trail, a 2,000-mile journey from Missouri to Oregon that epitomized the deadly nature of frontier travel. Of the approximately 400,000 people who attempted this journey between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 didn't survive. Think about that for a moment. The Oregon Trail was sometimes called the nation's longest graveyard because historians estimate that an average of 10 to 15 people died for every mile of the trail. That's a grave every 350 feet or so for 2,000 miles. The trail was literally lined with makeshift crosses and stone markers, many without names because families were forced to bury their loved ones and immediately continue their journey. Disease was the #1 killer on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water, was particularly devastating. This horrible illness caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluids so quickly that a person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. There was no effective treatment available. Wagon trains would sometimes lose dozens of people in a single cholera outbreak. Other diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever claimed countless additional lives. Children were especially vulnerable, with many families losing multiple children during the journey. Medical care on the trail was rudimentary at best, often consisting of folk remedies that did little to help and sometimes made conditions worse. When someone became seriously ill, the wagon train faced a terrible choice: stop and risk the entire group being trapped by winter weather, or leave the sick person behind to die alone. Crossing rivers presented another deadly challenge that wagon trains faced repeatedly. Wagons weren't designed to float, but pioneers had to cross numerous rivers on their journey west. Some had ferries or established fords, but many required the wagon to be floated across like a makeshift boat. The process was terrifying and often fatal. Wagon covers were stretched tight to create buoyancy, and the wagon was guided across by men swimming alongside or riding horses. Wagons frequently capsized in these crossings, drowning people and livestock while destroying precious supplies that families had carried across half the continent. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers claimed hundreds of lives during the migration period. Even experienced river crossers could be killed when swift currents, hidden rocks, or sudden weather changes turned a routine crossing into a disaster. Children were particularly vulnerable during river crossings. Many fell out of wagons or were swept away while trying to help with the crossing. The number of small graves near major river crossings along the Oregon Trail testified to how many young lives ended in these watery death traps. Weather on the trail wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be instantly lethal. Sudden thunderstorms could trigger flash floods that swept away entire wagon trains. Lightning strikes killed both people and animals, sometimes setting wagons on fire in the middle of nowhere. Blizzards were perhaps the most feared weather threat. Getting caught in a winter storm meant almost certain death for travelers without adequate shelter. The infamous Donner Party, trapped by early snows in the Sierra Nevada mountains, resorted to cannibalism to survive, and even then, nearly half the group died. Summer brought its own deadly challenges. Crossing desert regions in extreme heat killed travelers through dehydration and heat stroke. Water sources were often contaminated or simply non-existent for stretches of the trail. Many people died of thirst, within sight of water sources they didn't know existed. Tornadoes could appear with no warning, destroying everything in their path. Prairie fires, whether started by lightning or human carelessness, could travel faster than horses and trap entire wagon trains in walls of flame. Beyond the physical dangers, trail travel imposed a devastating psychological burden on families. Parents watched their children die and had to bury them in unmarked graves, knowing they'd probably never see those graves again. Spouses died and were left behind, while the surviving partner continued west with remaining children. The constant stress of danger, combined with grief, exhaustion, and uncertainty about the future, led many travelers to mental breakdown. Suicide wasn't uncommon among trail migrants, who simply couldn't bear the combination of loss and continuing hardship. Many families arrived at their destinations having lost everything: money, possessions, loved ones, and hope. The survivors were often physically and emotionally broken, facing the prospect of starting over with nothing in an unfamiliar and often hostile environment. Even short journeys between nearby towns presented significant dangers. Travelers might encounter outlaws who saw lone riders or small groups as easy targets. While stagecoach robberies were somewhat exaggerated in later fiction, they occurred regularly enough to be a legitimate concern for anyone carrying money or valuables. The natural environment posed constant threats even on familiar routes. Flash floods could wash out trails or trap unwary travelers. Summer heat in desert regions could kill through dehydration. Winter storms routinely trapped travelers, sometimes leading to freezing deaths. Getting lost was surprisingly easy in an era before detailed maps or reliable road signs. Travelers relied on vague directions, landmarks that could change or be misidentified, and the experience of guides who sometimes proved unreliable. Getting lost in the wilderness could be a death sentence, especially if your supplies ran low or you encountered hostile weather. Without GPS, detailed maps, or even reliable compasses in many cases, navigation was a constant challenge. Many travelers relied on natural landmarks, distinctive rock formations, mountain peaks, or river bends, but these could be obscured by weather or simply misidentified. The sun and stars provided basic directional guidance, but required knowledge that many travelers didn't possess. Cloud cover could leave travelers completely disoriented for days at a time. Even experienced frontiersmen sometimes became lost, and when that happened, the consequences were usually fatal. Trail markers, when they existed, were often unreliable. Previous travelers might have marked false trails, either by accident or deliberately to mislead followers. Wooden signs rotted or were destroyed by weather. Stone cairns could be knocked down by animals or weather. The truth about transportation in the Wild West is that it was slow, uncomfortable, expensive, and extremely dangerous. What we might consider a simple day trip today could be a multi-day ordeal that risked your life multiple times. Most people who moved west made the journey once and never traveled significant distances again. The physical, financial, and emotional cost was simply too high to make casual travel practical. Families often went years without seeing relatives, and many never saw their birthplaces again after moving west. The infrastructure that makes modern travel safe and reliable, paved roads, bridges, weather forecasting, emergency services, reliable vehicles, simply didn't exist. Every journey was a calculated risk, and many people lost that calculation with their lives. Even successful travel was exhausting and often left permanent physical damage. The constant jarring of wagon travel caused spinal problems, the stress damaged people's health, and the exposure to weather and disease often left travelers sicker than when they started. This is the reality of getting around in the Wild West, not romantic adventures across beautiful landscapes, but grueling ordeals that tested human endurance to its limits and beyond. Most modern people, accustomed to climate-controlled vehicles on smooth roads with emergency services just a phone call away, would find frontier travel absolutely unbearable. And remember, this is just getting from point A to point B. We haven't even talked about what you'd face when you actually arrived at your destination and tried to make a living in the Wild West economy. That's a whole other level of danger and hardship that makes the travel difficulties look like minor inconveniences. Let's say you've somehow survived the journey to the frontier and now need to figure out how to make a living. You've got several options, and they're all excellent ways to die horribly. Whether you choose mining, ranching, farming, or working for wages in the growing frontier towns, you're essentially picking your preferred method of destruction. You've heard the stories about the California gold rush, the Nevada silver strikes, and the Colorado mining booms. Tales of ordinary men finding nuggets the size of chicken eggs and becoming wealthy overnight have drawn hundreds of thousands west. What these stories conveniently leave out are the brutal realities that killed the vast majority of people who tried to strike it rich. First, you'd need to stake a claim, which by the 1870s meant finding unclaimed land with mineral potential, increasingly difficult since the easiest and richest areas had been claimed years earlier. If you were lucky enough to find a promising spot, you'd need to register your claim at the nearest government office and pay substantial fees that could wipe out your savings before you even started. Then the real work would begin, and it was some of the most physically demanding labor imaginable. For placer mining, searching for loose gold in streams, you'd spend hours bent over in ice-cold mountain water, sifting through sediment with a pan or a sluice box. Your hands would crack and bleed from constant exposure to water and rough materials. Your back would ache from the hunched position you'd maintain for 12 to 14 hours a day. After all that back-breaking effort, you'd be lucky to find a few tiny flakes of gold worth pennies. The vast majority of individual miners barely earned enough to cover their basic expenses, let alone strike it rich. If you decided to try hard rock mining, digging for veins of ore in the mountains, the dangers multiplied exponentially. You'd be tunneling into unstable rock without modern safety equipment or engineering knowledge. Cave-ins were frequent and usually fatal, crushing miners where they stood with no warning and no hope of rescue. Poorly ventilated mine shafts, filled with toxic gases like carbon monoxide, odorless and deadly. Miners would simply collapse and die, suffocating without even realizing what was happening. Others suffered slower deaths from silicosis, caused by constantly inhaling fine rock dust that gradually destroyed their lungs. Blasting operations were incredibly hazardous. Miners used black powder or early dynamite to break through rock, frequently losing fingers, hands, eyes, or lives when charges detonated prematurely. Even successful blasts could turn rock fragments into deadly projectiles that killed or maimed anyone in their path. The constant noise and percussion from blasting left many miners with permanent hearing loss. The physical demands of hauling heavy ore carts, working in cramped spaces, and operating primitive equipment destroyed miners' bodies within a few years. Those working in copper or lead mines absorbed toxic metals that accumulated in their bodies, causing neurological damage, tremors, and mental deterioration. Mercury, used in gold processing, caused similar devastating health effects. The mining industry had virtually no safety regulations. Mine owners prioritized profit over worker welfare, and injuries were considered an expected part of the job. A serious injury typically meant the end of a miner's career and livelihood, with no disability support or compensation available. For all these risks and hardships, what was the likely reward? Despite the mythology of the lucky prospector, the vast majority of miners barely earned subsistence wages. By the 1870s, most worked for large mining companies rather than independently, earning $2 to $3 for a grueling 10 to 12-hour day. Studies suggest that storekeepers, saloon owners, and prostitutes consistently made more money than the miners whose dreams sustained frontier mining towns. The people getting rich off the mining boom weren't the ones doing the dangerous work underground. The communities that grew up around mining operations were notoriously rough places. Picture a town composed primarily of young, single men engaged in dangerous work, with few women, families, or civilizing institutions. Add massive alcohol consumption. The average mining camp resident consumed several times more alcohol than typical Americans today, and you have a recipe for constant violence. Fights, stabbings, and shootings occurred regularly. Men who had spent all day risking their lives in dangerous mines often spent their evenings drinking away their fears and frustrations, leading to explosive confrontations over trivial matters. Sanitation in mining camps was typically abysmal. These communities sprang up quickly around mining sites with minimal planning or infrastructure. Human waste and garbage accumulated in streets and waterways. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly in these filthy conditions. During warm months, the stench could be overwhelming, and swarms of flies spread disease from waste to food sources. Many miners survived the dangers underground, only to die from preventable diseases caused by the appalling living conditions in their camps. Maybe mining doesn't appeal to you. The cattle industry was booming in the 1870s, with demand for beef in eastern cities creating opportunities on the frontier. Surely ranching would be healthier and more profitable than digging holes in dangerous mountains. Ranching did avoid some of the worst health hazards of mining, but it introduced its own unique dangers and hardships. Starting a ranch required significant capital. Land, livestock, equipment, and buildings all represented major investments. Many aspiring ranchers went deeply into debt, betting their futures on favorable weather and market conditions. Nature often had other plans. Droughts could wither grazing lands and dry up crucial water sources, forcing ranchers to watch their cattle starve or sell at devastating losses. Harsh winters could kill entire herds. The infamous Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887 saw up to 90% of cattle on northern ranges freeze or starve to death during unusually severe weather. Disease could sweep through herds, wiping out a rancher's investment overnight. Texas fever, anthrax, and other infectious diseases had no effective treatments in the 1870s. Predators like wolves and mountain lions took a constant toll on livestock, particularly vulnerable calves. Even if your cattle survived disease, predators, and weather, they could still be killed by poisonous plants, trapped in quicksand, or injured in countless ways that would cost you money and potentially your livelihood. The famous cattle drives, moving herds hundreds of miles to railroad shipping points, weren't romantic adventures, but grueling, dangerous undertakings. Cowboys worked 20-hour days during drives, catching brief naps in the saddle as they moved thousands of animals across difficult terrain. River crossings during cattle drives could turn deadly in minutes if animals panicked, creating deadly pileups that drowned both cattle and cowboys. Stampedes, which could be triggered by something as simple as a lightning strike or snapping twig, turned thousands of 1,500-pound animals into an unstoppable destructive force. Cowboys caught in stampedes were often trampled to death with no hope of escape. The cowboy's life was far from the freedom portrayed in Western mythology. They typically earned about $30 per month for exhausting, dangerous work. Most were very young men, often teenagers, from poor backgrounds with few other options. A significant percentage were Black, Mexican, or mixed-race individuals who faced discrimination that limited their opportunities elsewhere. Despite their essential role in the cattle industry, these cowboys were often paid less than white workers and faced additional dangers from racial violence. Cowboys' diet on cattle drives consisted mainly of beans, salt pork, and biscuits with minimal fresh food. Medical care was limited to whatever the trail cook might know about folk remedies. Injuries, which were common in such dangerous work, often went untreated until they became life-threatening. Many cowboys died young from injuries, exposure, or violence. The romantic image of the free-spirited cowboy was largely a later invention. The reality was young men doing dangerous work for poor pay under harsh conditions. Perhaps ranching and mining seemed too risky. What about farming? The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres free to anyone who would live on and improve the land for 5 years. This seemed like an incredible opportunity for people with little money to become landowners and build independent livelihoods. The reality proved far more challenging. First, 160 acres might sound substantial, but in the arid regions that comprised much of available land, it was often insufficient to support a family. Traditional Eastern farming methods failed in environments where rainfall was a fraction of what pioneers expected. Many settlers had no knowledge of dry farming techniques needed for success in these regions. They arrived with farming experience from wetter climates and found their knowledge useless in the harsh conditions of the Great Plains. Starting a frontier farm required tremendous physical labor. The first task was building shelter, typically a sod house on the treeless plains. These structures were constructed by cutting and stacking dense prairie turf, creating dark, damp dwellings that leaked when it rained, harbored insects and snakes, and crumbled without constant maintenance. Then came the back-breaking work of breaking prairie sod for planting. This sod, held together by grass roots that had developed over centuries, was extraordinarily difficult to plow with available equipment. It could take a year or more just to prepare a few acres for planting. The physical demands were so extreme, they permanently damaged many farmers' bodies. Men and women in their 30s often showed signs of premature aging, chronic pain, and disability from the relentless physical labor required to establish and maintain frontier farms. Once crops were planted, farmers faced threats from every direction. Drought could wither plants before harvest. Torrential rains could wash away seedlings or flood mature crops. Early frost could destroy crops just before harvest, wiping out an entire year's work. Grasshoppers descended in biblical swarms, consuming everything green in their path, and sometimes even eating tool handles left in fields. These insect invasions could strip bare thousands of acres in days, leaving families with no food and no income. Hailstorms could destroy crops in minutes. Prairie fires, whether started by lightning or human carelessness, could consume entire homesteads faster than families could evacuate. Tornadoes could wipe out years of work in seconds. Even successful farmers faced economic challenges that could destroy them financially. Transportation to markets was difficult and expensive. Without refrigeration, perishable products had to be sold quickly or preserved using methods that reduced their value. Large agricultural corporations and railroad companies used their influence to keep crop prices low and transportation costs high, squeezing independent farmers from both directions. Many families worked for years only to discover they couldn't make enough money to pay their debts and taxes. Frontier farms were often extremely isolated, with neighbors miles away. This isolation took a heavy psychological toll, especially on women who might go months without speaking to anyone outside their immediate family. Some women suffered from what was called prairie madness, severe depression and anxiety caused by isolation, constant work, and environmental hardships. Some affected individuals became violent toward family members or committed suicide. Others simply abandoned their homesteads and returned east, unable to endure the psychological pressure. Children on frontier farms often received minimal education because schools were too far away or didn't exist. Many grew up with only basic literacy skills, limiting their future opportunities. Child labor was essential for farm survival, with children as young as 6 working alongside adults at demanding physical tasks. Maybe independent enterprises like mining, ranching, or farming seemed too risky. Perhaps working for wages in growing frontier towns would offer more stability and security. Wage labor did avoid some of the financial risks of independent ventures, but it introduced its own hardships. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Workers in frontier factories, mills, and workshops suffered horrific injuries from unguarded machinery. Construction workers built increasingly tall structures without harnesses, safety equipment, or modern engineering knowledge, leading to frequent fatal falls. Railroad work was particularly dangerous. Track layers worked under brutal conditions with minimal equipment, suffering high rates of injury and death from accidents, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Chinese workers, who built much of the transcontinental railroad, were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, like handling unstable explosives to blast through mountain passes. They died at rates far higher than white workers, but their deaths were rarely recorded or investigated. Working hours were long by modern standards, typically 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Pay was low, with most workers barely earning subsistence wages. Child labor was common, with children as young as 8 working alongside adults in dangerous conditions. Workers had essentially no legal protections. Employers could fire people without cause, reduce wages arbitrarily, or withhold pay entirely. Those who complained or tried to organize for better conditions faced blacklisting, being marked as troublemakers that no employer in the region would hire. Many mining and lumber regions were dominated by company towns, where a single employer owned all housing and businesses. Workers in these communities paid inflated prices at company stores, lived in company housing, and were sometimes paid in scrip, company currency rather than legal tender. This created a form of debt bondage where workers could never save enough money to leave the system. Company stores charged prices high enough to keep workers perpetually in debt, effectively trapping them in cycles of poverty they couldn't escape. The working conditions in company towns were often appalling, with minimal safety standards and no recourse for workers who were injured or treated unfairly. Company bosses exercised near absolute control over workers' lives, determining not just working conditions but living situations, access to goods, and even social activities. The economic reality of the Wild West was harsh, unforgiving, and often deadly regardless of what work you chose. The stories of people striking it rich were real, but represented tiny percentages of those who tried. For every successful miner or rancher, hundreds died in poverty, broken by the physical demands and financial risks of frontier life. Most people who moved west worked incredibly hard for minimal rewards. They endured dangerous conditions, social isolation, and constant uncertainty about their economic survival. Many families spent years on the frontier only to abandon their efforts and return east, poorer and more damaged than when they started. The mythology of the self-made frontier success story obscures the reality that most economic opportunities in the Wild West were controlled by large corporations and wealthy investors. Individual miners, ranchers, and farmers were often squeezed out by better capitalized competitors or exploited by middlemen who controlled access to markets. The romantic image of the independent frontier entrepreneur building wealth through hard work and determination was largely false. Most wealth created in the Wild West went to railroad companies, mining corporations, cattle syndicates, and land speculators, not to the people doing the dangerous work. Understanding the economic realities of the Wild West helps explain why frontier life was so dangerous and difficult. It wasn't just the natural environment or lack of infrastructure that made survival challenging. It was an economic system that treated human lives as expendable resources in the pursuit of profit. Whether you chose mining, ranching, farming, or wage labor, you were entering an economy that offered minimal rewards for maximum risk. The vast majority of people who tried to make a living in the Wild West failed, and many paid for that failure with their health, their families, or their lives. This economic reality is perhaps the most important factor in understanding why the Wild West was so deadly. It wasn't just bad luck or natural disasters that killed people. It was a system that forced ordinary people to take extraordinary risks just to survive, with little hope of ever achieving the prosperity that drew them west in the first place. Now that we've covered how daily life, travel, and work would kill you in the Wild West, let's talk about the social structures, or rather, the lack thereof, that made frontier life even more dangerous. The reality of law enforcement, justice, social relationships, and community organization in the 1870s West would shock anyone accustomed to modern civil society. You might think that in such a dangerous environment, strong law enforcement would be a priority. You'd be wrong. The reality of frontier law enforcement was complex, inconsistent, and often more dangerous than the criminals it was supposed to stop. In major cities and established towns, there was usually some form of organized law enforcement, but vast rural areas had minimal or no official protection. A county sheriff might be responsible for maintaining order across thousands of square miles, making regular patrols impossible. These lawmen relied heavily on forming posses, groups of armed civilians, to pursue criminals or respond to emergencies. Town marshals handled law enforcement within town limits, sometimes with a few deputies in larger settlements. But these positions were dangerous and poorly paid, attracting a mix of dedicated public servants and people who enjoyed the power that came with a badge. Some famous lawmen moved freely between legitimate law enforcement and questionable enterprises throughout their careers. Federal marshals had jurisdiction across entire territories, but were few in number. They focused mainly on major federal crimes like counterfeiting, mail robbery, or offenses involving multiple jurisdictions. The legendary U.S. Marshals of Western movies, single-handedly bringing law to lawless towns, were largely fictional creations. The truth is that in many remote areas, justice was handled through informal community action rather than official legal processes. Vigilante groups formed when formal law enforcement was absent or ineffective. Sometimes these groups maintained basic order, but they could easily become vehicles for prejudice, personal vendettas, or mob violence. Vigilante justice was frighteningly common in frontier communities. When formal legal systems were absent, slow, or corrupt, communities often took matters into their own hands. This might sound reasonable in theory, but in practice, it was terrifying. Vigilante groups operated with no oversight, no appeals process, and no requirement for actual evidence. If you were accused of a serious crime, especially horse theft, cattle rustling, or murder, you might find yourself facing an angry mob that had already decided you were guilty. Lynch mobs were common and swift. The concept of innocent until proven guilty often didn't apply. If community sentiment turned against you, you could be hanging from a tree before sunset, regardless of your actual guilt or innocence. Many innocent people died simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or because someone with a grudge pointed a finger at them. The speed of frontier justice was both its appeal and its horror. Formal legal proceedings could take months and cost money that communities didn't have. A rope and a sturdy tree branch provided immediate, if not always accurate, resolution to criminal accusations. The iconic image of the quick-draw gunfight was largely a later invention. Most frontier violence was mundane, impulsive, and often alcohol-fueled. Bar fights that escalated to fatal levels, domestic violence, and disputes over land or livestock were far more common than dramatic shootouts on dusty streets. Real gunfights, when they occurred, were usually sudden and chaotic. Men drew weapons in the heat of anger, often while drunk, and blazed away at close range with little skill or accuracy. Many gunfight participants were wounded or killed by stray bullets rather than aimed shots. The famous gunfighters who captured public imagination, Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, operated in a specific historical window when formal law enforcement was establishing itself. Their later mythologization obscured the complex, often morally ambiguous reality of their lives. Hickok, far from the perfect marksman of legend, shot innocent bystanders in at least 2 gunfights. Earp worked as lawman, gambler, and vigilante across his career, sometimes within the same week. The Robin Hood image attached to Jesse James ignored his Confederate guerrilla background and the innocent victims of his robberies. When formal justice did function, criminal punishment was harsh by modern standards. Hanging was the standard penalty for murder, rape, and sometimes theft, particularly of horses or cattle, which were considered capital offenses because stealing them could mean death for the victims. Prisons existed, but were primitive facilities with high mortality rates from disease, violence, and poor conditions. Many communities preferred immediate execution to the expense of long-term imprisonment. Public hangings were social events that drew crowds from miles around. Corporal punishment was common for lesser offenses. Whipping, branding, or having ears cropped were standard penalties for theft or other crimes. These punishments were designed not just to punish, but to publicly mark criminals so everyone would know their history. The justice system, such as it was, reflected the harsh realities of frontier life. Communities couldn't afford to maintain criminals long-term, and the constant threat of violence made people favor swift, definitive responses to crime. Far from the helpless damsels or simple schoolmarms of Western movies, frontier women performed incredibly demanding physical labor while navigating restrictive social expectations that would appall modern women. On homesteads and farms, women handled traditional domestic duties, cooking, cleaning, childcare, and making clothing, but also worked in fields, tended livestock, and defended homes when necessary. Their workday typically started before dawn and ended well after dark, with few or no days of rest. A frontier woman might plow fields in the morning, deliver a neighbor's baby at midday, fight off predators threatening livestock in the afternoon, and still prepare meals and care for her own children throughout the day. Many became widows young due to dangerous frontier conditions and had to manage farms or businesses alone while raising children. Despite their essential contributions, women had few legal rights. In most territories and states, they couldn't vote, own property independently if married, or have custody of their children in the event of divorce. Domestic violence was considered a private matter with little legal recourse available to victims. For unmarried women, options were severely limited. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions, though female teachers were paid significantly less than their male counterparts and were often expected to resign upon marriage. Some found economic independence running boarding houses, working as nurses, or establishing millinery or dressmaking businesses. Many women found themselves in prostitution, often called soiled doves in frontier parlance. While later mythology romanticized these women, the reality was typically grim. Many entered the profession out of economic desperation after being widowed or abandoned. Physical abuse, drug addiction, and venereal disease were common hazards. Even women who managed to earn substantial money found themselves socially ostracized and unable to transition to more respectable positions. The double standard that created demand for their services also ensured they would be permanently excluded from respectable society. Childhood as we understand it barely existed on the frontier. Children were expected to contribute meaningful work to family survival from an early age, not as character-building chores, but as essential economic contributions. Children as young as 6 minded livestock, gathered eggs, picked vegetables, and watched younger siblings. By age 10 or 12, most frontier children worked alongside adults at nearly adult capacity. Boys followed fathers into fields, barns, or workshops, learning skills through direct participation rather than formal instruction. Girls worked with mothers, learning complex domestic skills, not simple housekeeping, but the production of essential goods like clothing, preserved food, candles, and soap. These weren't optional activities, but survival skills that could determine whether families lived or died. Children weren't sheltered from harsh realities. They witnessed births, deaths, animal slaughter, and sometimes violent conflicts. They were expected to understand and adapt to these realities rather than being protected from them. Education was limited and inconsistent. In established towns, schools might operate for a few months each year during winter, when agricultural work was minimal. One teacher, often barely educated themselves, might be responsible for students ranging from 5 to 17 years old, all studying in a single room. Physical conditions in schools were challenging. Buildings were poorly insulated, supplies were minimal, and corporal punishment was the standard disciplinary approach. In remote areas, formal schooling might not exist at all. Child mortality remained devastatingly high. Approximately 1 in 4 children died before reaching adulthood, with the highest risk in the first 5 years. Diseases that modern medicine easily prevents, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, routinely killed or permanently disabled young children. The psychological impact of this mortality on families is difficult for modern people to comprehend. Most children grew up watching siblings die. Parents expected to lose children and often gave the same name to subsequent children if older siblings died young. The Wild West wasn't populated solely by white cowboys and settlers. It was a meeting ground of cultures from around the world. But this diversity didn't mean equality or harmony. Racial violence was a common feature of frontier life that Hollywood largely ignored. Chinese immigrants, who played crucial roles in railroad construction and mining, faced particularly severe discrimination. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 grew from anti-Chinese sentiment that had festered for decades in Western territories. Chinese miners were frequently driven from productive claims through violence or discriminatory taxation. Chinese communities often faced riots and mass expulsions when economic conditions deteriorated. During hard times, white workers blamed Chinese immigrants for taking jobs and driving down wages, leading to organized violence against entire communities. Mexican Americans, many of whom had become U.S. citizens through territorial acquisition rather than immigration, faced systematic discrimination and land theft. Despite treaty guarantees protecting property rights following the Mexican-American War, Mexican landowners saw their holdings taken through legal manipulation, intimidation, or outright fraud. Black Americans who moved west hoping to escape Southern oppression often found frontier racism just as entrenched, if different in form. Despite crucial contributions to ranching, mining, and frontier development, they were frequently excluded from economic opportunities and social acceptance. Black cowboys made up as much as 25% of the workforce on some ranches, but rarely received recognition in contemporary accounts or later mythology. Black homesteaders established communities in several Western territories, but frequently faced organized resistance from white neighbors. For Native American nations, frontier expansion represented nothing short of apocalypse. The indigenous population of North America, once numbering perhaps 15 million, had been reduced to fewer than 300,000 by 1900 through disease, warfare, forced relocation, and deliberate destruction of food sources. The systematic destruction of buffalo herds wasn't just environmental devastation. It was deliberate policy to break Plains Indian resistance by eliminating their primary resource. General Philip Sheridan reportedly stated that buffalo hunters were doing more to defeat hostile tribes than the entire regular army. U.S. government policies systematically pushed Native Americans from traditional lands onto reservations, often in areas with poor soil and few resources. Treaties were regularly broken when valuable resources were discovered on reservation lands. Native children were forcibly removed from families and sent to boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. These children had their hair cut, were forbidden from speaking their languages or practicing their religions, and were forced to abandon their cultural identities. The romanticized cowboys versus Indians narratives of later films grossly misrepresented these interactions. Many native nations initially tried to accommodate newcomers and adapt to changing circumstances. Violence typically erupted after repeated treaty violations, encroachment on tribal lands, or deliberate provocations. Despite all these challenges, functional communities did emerge from frontier chaos. The process was neither smooth nor inevitable, but certain patterns emerged across the West. Churches played crucial roles beyond their spiritual function. They served as social hubs, educational centers, and mutual aid societies. Even those with limited religious conviction often participated in church activities for community connection. The establishment of schools, meeting halls, and other civic institutions marked important milestones in community development. These buildings represented commitments to permanent settlement rather than temporary resource extraction. Frontier communities developed distinctive forms of mutual aid necessary for survival. Barn raisings allowed families to complete large construction projects impossible for individual households. Harvest teams moved from farm to farm, ensuring crops were gathered before weather could destroy them. These cooperative traditions reflected practical reality. No individual or family could survive the frontier entirely through self-reliance. Community interdependence coexisted with the individualism that later became mythologized in frontier narratives. Despite the democratic ideals often associated with frontier life, social hierarchies quickly established themselves in frontier communities. Those with capital, education, or political connections gained advantages that often proved insurmountable for ordinary settlers. Merchants who supplied mining camps often became wealthy while miners remained poor. Railroad companies and large landholders accumulated vast holdings while homesteaders struggled on marginal land. Professional men, doctors, lawyers, bankers, commanded respect and influence disproportionate to their numbers. These social divisions became more pronounced as communities matured. Early mining camps or cattle towns might have rough equality among participants, but as settlements grew, formal class distinctions emerged that mirrored Eastern society. Frontier entertainment reflected the harsh realities of frontier life. Saloons weren't just drinking establishments, but social centers where men gathered for conversation, gambling, and rare moments of relaxation. But even entertainment was often violent or dangerous. Gambling disputes frequently turned deadly. Alcohol consumption was astronomical by modern standards. The average frontier male consumed several times more alcohol than typical Americans today. Traveling entertainment, circuses, theatrical troupes, or musical performers were rare treats that drew people from miles around. These events provided precious breaks from the monotony and hardship of frontier life. Religious revivals served similar functions, combining spiritual experience with social interaction. Camp meetings could last for days, bringing together people who otherwise lived in isolation. The harsh realities of frontier social life created communities that were simultaneously more cooperative and more violent than modern society. The constant threat of death or economic disaster forced people to depend on each other in ways that created strong bonds, but the same pressures also led to explosive conflicts when cooperation broke down. Understanding frontier society requires recognizing these contradictions. Communities that would come together to fight prairie fires or search for lost children could also form lynch mobs or engage in racial violence. The same harsh conditions that fostered mutual aid also created the desperation that led to crime and violence. This is the social reality of the Wild West, not a simple morality tale of good versus evil, but a complex society struggling to create order and meaning under conditions that tested human nature to its limits. Your breakfast? Beans, biscuits, and coffee that barely resembles what you know. The Wild West diet was nutritionally devastating. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries, and scurvy, where your gums bleed and teeth fall out, was common, despite being easily preventable. Before heading outside, you'd better shake out your boots for scorpions and snakes that sought shelter overnight. One venomous bite could mean death, and the nearest doctor might be days away. Step outside and you realize how exposed you are. Extreme weather appeared with zero warning. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, or drought could all kill the unprepared in minutes. The sky might be clear now, but that could change before you finish this sentence. If you lived in a frontier town, congratulations. You just traded wilderness dangers for different ways to die. Towns were hotbeds of disease without proper sewage systems. Cholera, typhoid, and smallpox spread like wildfire and could wipe out half the population in weeks. Got sick? You were probably going to die. Most frontier doctors had little to no training. Surgery was performed without anesthesia beyond whiskey, and sterilization was virtually unknown. A simple infected cut could lead to amputation or death. Common treatments included bloodletting, mercury compounds, and arsenic, substances that often killed faster than the original illness. Women faced a 1 in 4 chance of dying in childbirth in remote areas. The famous quick draw gunfights, pure Hollywood fiction. Real frontier violence was sudden, chaotic, and usually happened during drunken bar fights or robberies. Most people who died violently were trampled by cattle, crushed by wagon wheels, or accidentally shot by inexperienced gun handlers. The romanticized Wild West is a myth. The reality was a brutal struggle for survival, where death was an everyday companion, not a distant stranger. Want to make money? Every job was a death sentence waiting to happen. Mining was basically Russian roulette with extra steps. Cave-ins crushed workers without warning. Toxic gases like carbon monoxide silently suffocated miners who had no idea they were breathing poison. Blasting with dynamite frequently killed people when charges went off early, or rock fragments became deadly projectiles. Even if you avoided immediate death, the long-term effects were horrifying. Miners constantly inhaled rock dust, causing silicosis, a disease that slowly suffocated you over years. Mercury used in gold processing caused neurological damage, tremors, and mental deterioration. Ranching wasn't better. Cattle drives meant 20-hour days, catching brief naps in the saddle. River crossings turned deadly when thousands of panicked animals created stampedes. Cowboys caught in these stampedes were trampled to death by 1,500-pound animals, moving like an unstoppable tsunami. And farming? You'd break prairie sod so dense and tough it could take a year just to prepare a few acres for planting. The work permanently damaged people's bodies, leaving most farmers hunched and arthritic by age 30. The reality? Every profession was a different flavor of death sentence. The people getting rich weren't the ones doing the dangerous work. They were the storekeepers, saloon owners, and business people who sold supplies to the desperate workers, risking their lives for pennies. Decided to travel somewhere? You just signed your death warrant. The famous Oregon Trail was literally called America's longest graveyard. Of the 400,000 people who attempted the 2,000-mile journey, 1 in 10 died along the way. That's a grave every 350 feet for 2,000 miles straight. Cholera could kill you so fast that people were healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. River crossings turned into death traps when thousands of panicked animals created stampedes that crushed anything in their path. Even short trips between towns were Russian roulette. Your horse could step in a prairie dog hole and break its leg, stranding you miles from help. Flash floods appeared without warning, washing away entire wagon trains. Getting lost without GPS or reliable maps meant almost certain death. Wagon travel was medieval torture. No suspension meant feeling every rock and rut for hundreds of miles. The constant jarring caused wagon sickness that left travelers vomiting for weeks. And if your wagon broke down in the middle of nowhere, good luck fixing it with whatever scraps you had. Think there was law and order? Think again. One sheriff might be responsible for thousands of square miles. Justice was often handled by lynch mobs who decided guilt based on rumors and personal grudges. Accused of horse theft? You could be hanging from a tree before sunset, whether you were guilty or not. The famous quick-draw gunfights? Pure Hollywood fiction. Real frontier violence was drunken bar fights that escalated when everyone was armed. Most people who died in gunfights were hit by stray bullets from panicked men blazing away at close range. Vigilante justice was the norm. Communities formed armed groups that operated with zero oversight and no appeals process. If they decided you were guilty, you were dead. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was a luxury frontier towns couldn't afford. Even the legendary lawmen were morally ambiguous at best. Wyatt Earp worked as lawman, gambler, and vigilante, sometimes all in the same week. Wild Bill Hickok shot innocent bystanders in multiple gunfights. These weren't heroes, they were survivors in a system. Women had it even worse than men, and that's saying something. Forget the helpless damsels from movies. Frontier women did back-breaking physical labor while trapped in multiple layers of clothing, regardless of temperature. They worked 20-hour days, cooking, cleaning, childcare, making clothing, working in fields, tending livestock, and defending homes from predators. Many became widows young because of dangerous frontier conditions, then had to manage farms or businesses alone while raising children. Despite doing essential work, they had zero legal rights, couldn't vote, couldn't own property if married, couldn't have custody of their own children in divorce. Childbirth was a death sentence lottery. 1 in 4 women died giving birth in remote areas. No prenatal care, no pain relief, no sterile conditions. Women approached each pregnancy knowing it might literally be their last experience in life. For unmarried women, options were teaching for starvation wages or prostitution. Many soiled doves entered the profession out of desperation after being widowed or abandoned. Physical abuse, addiction, and disease were daily realities, with no legal protection or social support. There was no such thing as childhood on the frontier. Kids as young as 6 were expected to do essential work for family survival. Not cute chores, but life or death responsibilities. By age 10, children worked alongside adults at nearly adult capacity. Boys followed fathers into dangerous work. Girls learned complex domestic skills that could determine whether families lived or died. Children weren't sheltered from anything. They witnessed births, deaths, animal slaughter, and violent conflicts. They were expected to handle adult realities because frontier life couldn't afford the luxury of protecting children's innocence. Education was a joke when it existed at all. One barely educated teacher might handle students aged 5 to 17 in a single room for a few months during winter. Physical punishment was standard, beatings for infractions as minor as whispering. The mortality rate was devastating. 1 in 4 children died before reaching adulthood. Diseases that are easily preventable today, measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, routinely killed entire families. Most children grew up watching siblings die and knowing they might be next. The Wild West wasn't just white cowboys and settlers. It was a violent collision of cultures where racial violence was constant. And Chinese immigrants built the railroads doing the most dangerous jobs for lower pay, then faced organized riots and mass expulsions when times got tough. White workers blamed them for every economic problem and responded with systematic violence against entire communities. Mexican Americans who became citizens through territorial acquisition saw their lands stolen through legal manipulation and outright fraud. Despite treaty guarantees, they lost everything to white settlers, backed by corrupt courts. Black cowboys made up 25% of ranch workers, but were written out of history. Black homesteaders faced organized resistance, discriminatory law enforcement, and violence from white neighbors who didn't want them succeeding. For Native Americans, frontier expansion was genocide. The population dropped from 15 million to 300,000 through systematic warfare, forced relocation, and deliberate destruction of food sources. Buffalo herds were exterminated specifically to starve plains tribes into submission. Children were kidnapped and forced into boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. Nature itself was trying to kill you every single day. Weather appeared with zero warning and could end your life in minutes. Blizzards stranded travelers, leading to death by exposure. Tornadoes destroyed entire communities with no emergency services to help. Flash floods washed away wagon trains, drowning families who thought they were safe. Prairie fires moved faster than horses, trapping settlers in walls of flame. Drought could ruin crops and cause widespread starvation. Grasshopper swarms descended like biblical plagues, consuming everything green and sometimes even eating tool handles. The wildlife was a constant threat. Bears, wolves, mountain lions, and venomous snakes weren't just occasional dangers, they were daily realities that could kill the unwary. Scorpions hid in boots and clothing. Even seemingly harmless animals could be deadly when they carried diseases like rabies. Water sources were often contaminated or poisonous. Many settlers died of thirst within sight of water they didn't know was undrinkable. Rivers could be peaceful one day and raging torrents the next, with no warning system to alert travelers. Every Western movie you've ever seen is a complete lie, designed to hide the truth. The mythology was created precisely when the real frontier was disappearing. Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows in the 1880s featured staged reenactments for Eastern audiences who had never experienced frontier reality. Dime novels written by people who'd never been West created fictional heroes and adventures. Hollywood perfected the lies. Clean cowboys with perfect teeth, romantic gunfights with clear good guys and bad guys, noble lawmen bringing civilization to chaos. None of it was real. The real West offered no heroes, just people struggling to survive in conditions that would break most modern humans. There were no good guys or bad guys, just desperate people making impossible choices with limited options. The mythology served a purpose. It made Americans feel good about expansion and conquest. It justified genocide, environmental destruction, and economic exploitation by painting them as inevitable progress. It created simple moral frameworks where complex historical realities demanded nuanced understanding. What Hollywood couldn't show was the truth, that frontier expansion was built on the bones of millions of people who died horrible deaths for other people's profit. So, what would have happened to you in the Wild West? Let's be brutally honest. Within 24 hours, you'd probably be dead from disease, injury, violence, environmental exposure, or simple accident. If you somehow survived the first day, the relentless physical demands would start breaking down your body immediately. Most people who moved west failed completely. They lost their money, their health, their families, and often their lives. The successful stories you hear about were tiny exceptions. For every person who struck it rich, hundreds died in poverty and anonymity. The people who survived weren't necessarily stronger or smarter. They were lucky. Lucky to avoid disease outbreaks, lucky to miss the worst weather, lucky not to be in the wrong place when violence erupted, lucky to have their bodies hold up under impossible demands. Modern people, accustomed to safety regulations, medical care, abundant food, and climate control, would have zero chance in frontier conditions. The skills, physical conditioning, and psychological toughness required for frontier survival took years to develop, and most people died before they could adapt. The Wild West killed the vast majority of people who tried to conquer it. The few survivors paid a terrible price: broken bodies, traumatized minds, and a life expectancy half of what we consider normal today. This is the truth Hollywood never wanted you to see. The Wild West wasn't an adventure or a test of character. It was a meat grinder that consumed human lives for the profit of a few wealthy individuals who never had to face its dangers themselves. Food wasn't just scarce, it was actively trying to kill you. Most preserved meat was so loaded with salt, it could strip paint. The salt was necessary to prevent bacterial growth, but consuming it caused massive kidney damage and high blood pressure that killed people in their 30s. Flour was frequently contaminated with rat droppings, insect parts, and mold that caused hallucinations and organ failure. Families simply accepted a certain amount of pest contamination in their food as unavoidable. Canned goods, when available, were death traps. Early canning processes were primitive and often resulted in botulism, a toxin so deadly that a single contaminated can could kill an entire family. Symptoms included paralysis, difficulty breathing, and eventual suffocation. Many settlers died of scurvy, despite having access to prevention. They didn't understand that fresh vegetables could save their lives, so they spent winters eating salt pork and hardtack while their gums bled and teeth fell out. Food poisoning was a regular occurrence with no understanding of safe food handling. Milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, causing deadly bacterial infections. Meat was often partially rotten when consumed, leading to violent illness that could kill within days. Every piece of frontier technology was a disaster waiting to happen. The Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887 killed 90% of cattle on northern ranges during an unusually harsh winter. Ranchers who were wealthy in November were bankrupt by spring, their fortunes literally frozen to death in the snow. Cattle that survived were walking skeletons, and the ones that didn't became scattered bones across the prairie. This single weather event destroyed the open-range cattle industry and ruined thousands of families who had invested everything in livestock. Railroad disasters were horrifically common and spectacularly deadly. Trains derailed regularly because tracks were laid hastily over unstable ground with minimal engineering oversight. When locomotives weighing tons hit curves at full speed on poorly constructed rails, the results were catastrophic. Wooden passenger cars splintered like matchsticks, trapping passengers in wreckage that often caught fire from overturned oil lamps or hot coals from the engine. Boiler explosions turned locomotives into bombs that could kill everyone within hundreds of feet. Early steam engines operated at dangerous pressures with primitive safety systems. When boilers failed, superheated steam and metal fragments became deadly projectiles. Entire train crews could be vaporized instantly, and passengers in nearby cars were often scalded to death by escaping steam. Bridge collapses were routine because frontier bridges were built quickly and cheaply over rivers and canyons that posed engineering challenges beyond the capabilities of the era. When heavily loaded trains crossed bridges designed by optimistic rather than competent engineers, the results were predictable. Entire trains would plunge into rivers or canyons, often during floods when rescue was impossible. The transcontinental railroad construction itself was a massive killing machine. Workers died from explosives accidents, falls from cliffs, cave-ins, equipment failures, and exposure to extreme weather. Chinese workers, who built the most dangerous sections through the Sierra Nevada mountains, died at rates that would be considered criminal today. They were lowered down cliff faces in wicker baskets to place dynamite charges, with fatal accidents happening almost daily. Mining equipment was primitive and deadly. Steam-powered machinery operated without safety guards, readily crushing or mangling workers who got too close. Minecarts running on primitive tracks regularly derailed, crushing workers or trapping them underground. Hoisting equipment failed regularly, sending loaded carts and workers plummeting down mine shafts. Explosives handling was essentially legalized suicide. Miners used black powder and early dynamite without understanding proper safety procedures. Charges detonated prematurely, killing workers instantly. Even successful blasts created deadly rockfalls that could crush miners who didn't retreat far enough. The constant use of explosives in confined spaces also created toxic fumes that slowly poisoned workers over time. Ventilation systems in mines were primitive or non-existent. Miners regularly died from carbon monoxide poisoning, methane gas explosions, or simple suffocation. Warning systems for dangerous gases were crude. Miners would carry canaries into shafts, and when the birds died, workers knew the air was poisonous. By then, it was often too late to escape. Agricultural technology was equally dangerous. Primitive plows and farm equipment had no safety features and regularly maimed farmers. Horses spooked easily around unfamiliar machinery, often trampling operators or running away with equipment still attached, dragging farmers to their deaths. Threshing machines were particularly deadly. These devices used rapidly spinning components to separate grain from stalks, and farmers regularly lost fingers, hands, or entire arms when they tried to clear jams or perform maintenance on running equipment. Unlike modern machinery with safety shutoffs, frontier equipment continued operating even when workers were being injured. Water well drilling was extremely hazardous. Wells often collapsed during construction, burying workers alive. The primitive drilling equipment used heavy weights, dropped repeatedly to break through rock, and when these systems failed, workers were crushed by falling machinery. Even successful wells could become death traps if diggers encountered underground gas pockets that exploded when exposed to open flames. Sawmill operations were industrial-scale killing machines. Massive circular saws operated without guards, easily severing limbs of workers who got too close. Steam-powered equipment operated at high pressures with minimal safety systems, leading to regular scalding injuries and equipment explosions. Workers routinely died from being struck by logs, crushed by machinery, or caught in the complex belt systems that transferred power throughout the mills. Frontier construction techniques were disasters waiting to happen. Buildings were constructed quickly with minimal engineering knowledge, using whatever materials were locally available. Multi-story structures regularly collapsed, often without warning, crushing everyone inside. Fire was a constant threat because buildings were constructed primarily of wood, with minimal fire safety considerations. The lack of building codes meant structures were often death traps. Upper floors were supported by inadequate framing that couldn't handle the weight, leading to sudden collapses. Stairs were built at dangerous angles without proper railings, and people regularly fell to their deaths simply trying to reach second floors. Heating systems were primitive and dangerous. Fireplaces and wood stoves were poorly designed and inadequately vented, leading to regular carbon monoxide poisoning. Chimney fires were common and often spread to destroy entire buildings. Many frontier families died in their sleep from breathing toxic fumes from improperly installed heating systems. Oil lamps and candles provided the only lighting but were constant fire hazards. Overturned lamps could ignite entire buildings within minutes. Many frontier towns burned to the ground repeatedly because one carelessly placed lamp or candle could start fires that consumed wooden structures faster than residents could escape. Even basic tools were dangerous in frontier conditions. Axes and other cutting tools were often poorly maintained and improperly used, leading to severe injuries in situations where medical care was unavailable. A simple cut that would be minor today could become infected and lead to death or amputation in frontier conditions. Transportation technology was primitive and unreliable. Wagon wheels regularly broke under the stress of frontier travel, often stranding families in dangerous wilderness areas. Axles snapped, leaving travelers helpless miles from assistance. Even basic repair work was dangerous because jacking up heavy wagons often resulted in crushing injuries when primitive lifting equipment failed. River ferry systems were death traps that regularly drowned passengers. These primitive cable-operated platforms could capsize in swift currents or when overloaded. Ferry operators were often inexperienced, and safety equipment was minimal or non-existent. Many families drowned within sight of their destinations because ferry technology was inadequate for the powerful rivers they needed to cross. Weather prediction was non-existent, meaning that technological systems were regularly overwhelmed by natural disasters they couldn't anticipate. Telegraph lines went down in storms, cutting communication when it was most needed. Railroad schedules didn't account for weather delays, often leaving passengers stranded in dangerous conditions. Construction projects proceeded without weather considerations, leading to regular disasters when storms struck work sites. The cumulative effect of technological failures was that frontier life involved constant exposure to industrial accidents that would be prevented by modern safety systems. Every day brought new opportunities for machinery to malfunction, equipment to fail, or technological systems to break down in ways that killed or injured the people depending on them. Medical technology was particularly horrifying. Surgical instruments were crude and often unsterilized, leading to infections that killed more patients than the original injuries. Anesthesia was primitive and dangerous. Many patients died from overdoses of chloroform or ether. Even successful surgeries often resulted in death from post-operative infections that couldn't be prevented with available technology. Dental technology was essentially medieval torture. Tooth extraction was performed with crude pliers without anesthesia. Many people suffered from severe dental problems for years because the available treatments were often worse than the original problems. Infected teeth regularly led to blood poisoning and death because effective antibiotics didn't exist. The transportation of sick and injured people was itself often fatal. Primitive ambulances were basically wooden carts that subjected patients to jarring rides over rough terrain. Many people who might have survived their injuries died from the trauma of being transported to medical care over frontier roads that were little more than rutted tracks. Communication technology was unreliable and often counterproductive. Telegraph lines frequently went down, cutting communities off from the outside world during emergencies. When messages did get through, they were often garbled or delayed to the point of uselessness. The failure of technological systems had cascading effects that multiplied dangers throughout frontier society. When communication failed, communities couldn't warn each other about threats. When transportation failed, supplies couldn't reach isolated settlements. When medical technology failed, treatable conditions became death sentences. The primitive nature of frontier technology meant that single points of failure could doom entire communities. This technological unreliability created a constant state of uncertainty that added psychological stress to the already overwhelming physical dangers of frontier life. People never knew when the systems they depended on might fail catastrophically, leaving them helpless in hostile environments. The combination of primitive technology and harsh conditions created a perfect storm of dangers that killed people in ways that would be easily prevented today. The Wild West didn't just kill people's bodies, it systematically destroyed minds, cultures, and entire ways of life in ways that would be considered psychological warfare today. The frontier created a unique form of psychological torture through its combination of extreme isolation, constant mortal danger, and repeated traumatic losses. Modern psychiatrists would recognize frontier conditions as a perfect recipe for what we now call complex PTSD, but in the 1870s, people had no understanding of mental health or trauma treatment. They were expected to endure conditions that would break trained soldiers while maintaining their sanity and functionality. Isolation was perhaps the most underestimated killer on the frontier. Human beings are social creatures who require regular interaction with others to maintain psychological stability, but frontier life often meant going weeks or months with minimal human contact. Homesteaders might see their closest neighbors only a few times per year, and those neighbors could be miles away across dangerous terrain. Women suffered disproportionately from isolation-induced mental breakdown because they were typically confined to homesteads while men traveled for supplies, work, or social interaction. Their diaries and letters document the gradual erosion of sanity under conditions of extreme loneliness. Many women wrote about talking to themselves, to animals, or to imaginary companions just to hear human voices, even if they were their own. The psychological impact was compounded by the fact that women were expected to maintain complex domestic operations while completely alone. They had to care for children, manage household production, defend against threats, and maintain their mental stability without any adult support or conversation. Many simply couldn't handle the psychological pressure and developed what frontier doctors called prairie madness, a condition characterized by depression, anxiety, paranoia, and sometimes complete psychotic breaks. Men weren't immune to isolation-induced mental illness, but they typically had more opportunities for human contact through work and travel. However, the constant pressure of being solely responsible for family survival in hostile conditions created its own form of psychological destruction. Many men developed severe anxiety disorders, depression, and what would now be recognized as PTSD from repeated exposure to life-threatening situations. The frontier created a culture of emotional suppression that prevented people from processing trauma in healthy ways. Showing weakness or vulnerability was literally dangerous because it might undermine confidence in your ability to survive. People were expected to endure the deaths of children, spouses, and friends without displaying grief that might demoralize others. This emotional suppression led to widespread psychological damage that often manifested in alcoholism, violence, or complete mental breakdown. Alcoholism was epidemic on the frontier, serving as the primary method of self-medication for psychological trauma. The average frontier resident consumed several times more alcohol than modern Americans, and this wasn't recreational drinking. It was desperate self-medication for unbearable psychological pain. Saloons weren't just social centers. They were informal psychiatric hospitals where traumatized people tried to numb their pain with whatever alcohol was available. The quality of frontier alcohol made the problem worse. Much of the liquor was raw, poorly distilled spirits that contained impurities and toxic compounds. People weren't just becoming alcoholics. They were slowly poisoning themselves with methanol, lead, and other contaminants that caused brain damage and organ failure. Many frontier alcoholics died not from liver disease, but from acute poisoning caused by drinking contaminated spirits. Domestic violence was rampant, but largely invisible because families were isolated and women had no legal recourse. Men who might have been stable in civilized conditions became violent under the psychological pressure of frontier life. The combination of alcohol, trauma, isolation, and unlimited access to weapons created perfect conditions for family violence that often escalated to murder. Children suffered particularly severe psychological damage because they were exposed to adult trauma without any understanding or support systems. Frontier children witnessed horrific violence, death, and suffering as routine parts of daily life. They watched siblings die from disease, saw parents break down under impossible pressure, and experienced trauma that would hospitalize modern children. The lack of childhood as a protected developmental phase meant that children never learned healthy coping mechanisms for trauma. They were expected to function as adults from an early age, handling life or death responsibilities without the emotional or cognitive development to process what they were experiencing. Many frontier children developed severe anxiety disorders, depression, and behavioral problems that persisted throughout their lives. Educational systems, when they existed, were often psychologically damaging rather than supportive. One-room schoolhouses were frequently run by teachers who were themselves traumatized and poorly educated. Physical punishment was the primary disciplinary method, with children being beaten for minor infractions in environments that were supposed to provide safety and learning. The cultural destruction inflicted on Native American populations represents one of the most systematic psychological warfare campaigns in human history. The deliberate targeting of children through forced boarding schools was designed to destroy indigenous cultures by breaking the transmission of knowledge between generations. Native children were forcibly removed from families and subjected to what would now be recognized as severe psychological abuse. They were forbidden from speaking their languages, practicing their religions, or maintaining any connection to their cultural identities. Children who spoke their native languages were beaten, locked in isolation, or subjected to other punishments designed to break their connection to their heritage. The boarding school system was explicitly designed to kill the Indian and save the man, which meant systematically destroying everything that made these children who they were. They were given English names, forced to cut their hair, dressed in military-style uniforms, and subjected to harsh discipline designed to break their spirits and remake them as Anglo-American citizens. The psychological trauma inflicted on Native children had generational effects that persist today. Children who survived boarding schools often returned to their communities as strangers, unable to communicate with their own families or participate in traditional cultural practices. They had been systematically traumatized and often inflicted that trauma on their own children, creating cycles of abuse and cultural disconnection that lasted for generations. The destruction of buffalo herds wasn't just economic warfare against plains tribes, it was deliberate psychological torture designed to break indigenous peoples' connection to their spiritual and cultural foundations. Buffalo weren't just a food source. They were central to Plains Indian cosmology, social organization, and cultural identity. The systematic extermination of these animals was intended to destroy not just indigenous economies, but their entire way of understanding the world. Missionaries and government agents worked systematically to destroy indigenous religious practices through a combination of legal prohibition and psychological manipulation. Native people were told that their spiritual beliefs were evil, primitive, or satanic, and they were forced to adopt Christianity under threat of starvation or violence. This systematic destruction of spiritual foundations created profound psychological trauma that undermined indigenous communities' ability to maintain cultural coherence. The reservation system was designed as a form of psychological imprisonment that would gradually destroy indigenous cultures through enforced dependency and cultural isolation. Native peoples who had been self-sufficient for thousands of years were confined to inadequate reservations where they couldn't practice traditional subsistence activities and were forced to depend on government rations for survival. The psychological impact of this forced dependency was devastating. Proud, independent peoples were systematically humiliated and infantilized, told they were incapable of caring for themselves and needed white supervision to survive. This psychological warfare was intended to break indigenous people's sense of cultural pride and independence, making them more willing to accept assimilation into white society. Mexican-American communities faced their own forms of cultural destruction as their lands were systematically stolen through legal manipulation and economic pressure. Families who had lived on the same land for generations found themselves dispossessed and culturally displaced, forced to abandon traditional ways of life and adapt to Anglo-American legal and economic systems that discriminated against them. The loss of land was particularly traumatic for Mexican-American families because it represented not just economic displacement, but the destruction of cultural continuity. Traditional land use patterns, social relationships, and cultural practices were all tied to specific geographic locations that were taken by Anglo settlers who had no understanding of or respect for existing cultural landscapes. Chinese immigrants faced systematic psychological warfare designed to make them feel unwelcome and encourage them to leave. Anti-Chinese violence wasn't just physical, it was carefully orchestrated psychological terrorism that included economic boycotts, legal discrimination, and social ostracism designed to break Chinese communities' ability to establish permanent roots in American society. The Chinese Exclusion Act represented not just legal discrimination, but systematic psychological warfare against an entire ethnic group. Chinese families were torn apart by immigration laws that prevented them from bringing wives and children to America, creating communities of psychologically isolated men who could never establish normal family lives. African Americans who moved west, hoping to escape Southern oppression, found themselves facing different but equally devastating forms of psychological warfare. While they might escape chattel slavery, they encountered systematic discrimination, violence, and economic exclusion that made clear they would never be accepted as full participants in American society. Black cowboys, farmers, and entrepreneurs who achieved success despite discrimination faced constant psychological pressure from white communities that resented their achievements. Successful black families were often targeted for violence or economic sabotage designed to keep them in subordinate positions regardless of their abilities or accomplishments. The frontier created a culture of paranoia and suspicion that poisoned social relationships and prevented the development of stable communities. Everyone was a potential threat. Neighbors might steal your land, business partners might cheat you, and strangers might be outlaws or con artists. This constant suspicion made it difficult to develop the trust and cooperation necessary for healthy community development. Women faced unique forms of psychological warfare through systematic legal and social discrimination that made clear they were considered inferior beings regardless of their contributions to frontier survival. They could work as hard as men, face the same dangers, and make essential contributions to community development, but they remained legal non-entities without basic rights or protections. The psychological impact of this systematic devaluation was devastating for women who had demonstrated their capabilities under extreme conditions but were still treated as dependents and inferiors. Many frontier women developed severe depression and anxiety from the contradiction between their actual abilities and their social status. Religious communities often inflicted their own forms of psychological damage through rigid doctrines that blamed individuals for natural disasters and social problems beyond their control. Frontier religion was often harsh and punitive, telling people that their suffering was divine punishment for moral failings rather than the predictable result of impossible living conditions. The combination of extreme physical hardship and psychological warfare created frontier societies that were often barely functional despite their reputation for rugged individualism. High rates of alcoholism, domestic violence, mental illness, and social dysfunction were the predictable results of subjecting human beings to conditions that exceeded their psychological and cultural capacity to adapt. The long-term psychological consequences of frontier expansion affected not just the people who experienced it directly, but their children and grandchildren. Trauma was passed down through generations in families who never learned healthy ways to process loss, violence, and displacement. Many frontier families developed patterns of dysfunction that persisted long after they achieved economic stability and physical security. The mythology of frontier life as character building and spiritually beneficial was developed specifically to hide the psychological devastation that expansion actually caused. The reality was that frontier conditions broke more people than they strengthened, creating trauma and dysfunction that undermined the very communities that expansion was supposed to create. The economic system of the Wild West was deliberately designed to extract maximum profit from human lives while ensuring that the people doing the dangerous work remained trapped in cycles of poverty and debt. This wasn't accidental. It was a carefully constructed system of exploitation that treated human beings as expendable resources in the pursuit of wealth for distant investors. Company towns represented the most extreme form of economic exploitation, creating systems of debt bondage that were barely distinguishable from slavery. Mining and lumber companies would establish settlements in remote areas where they owned everything: the housing, the stores, the currency, and often the local government. Workers were completely dependent on company-provided services and had no alternatives or escape routes. The company store system was designed to ensure that workers could never accumulate enough money to leave. Prices were set artificially high, often 200 to 300% above what the same goods would cost in competitive markets. A can of beans that cost 25 cents in eastern cities might cost $2 at a company store. Workers were paid in company scrip instead of legal currency, which could only be spent at company-owned businesses. This created a closed economic loop where workers' labor generated profits for the company, but their wages immediately flowed back to the company through overpriced goods and services. Workers found themselves perpetually in debt to their employers, unable to leave because they owed more money than they could ever earn. Families spent years working for companies while actually becoming poorer over time. Housing in company towns was another form of economic exploitation. Workers were required to live in company-owned buildings and pay rent that consumed large portions of their wages. The housing was typically substandard, poorly constructed, overcrowded, and inadequately heated or ventilated. But workers had no choice except to pay whatever rent the company demanded or face immediate termination and eviction. Company scrip systems were particularly insidious because they prevented workers from participating in the broader economy. Scrip could only be used at company stores, so workers couldn't shop around for better prices or save money by purchasing goods elsewhere. The scrip often lost value over time or became worthless if the company failed, meaning workers could lose their entire life savings overnight. Railroad companies pioneered many of the most exploitative labor practices that became standard across frontier industries. Construction of the Transcontinental Railroad killed thousands of workers, but these deaths were considered acceptable costs of doing business. Chinese workers were deliberately given the most dangerous jobs, handling unstable explosives, working on cliff faces, clearing avalanches, because their lives were considered less valuable than those of white workers. Railroad companies paid Chinese workers significantly less than white workers while subjecting them to far more dangerous conditions. When Chinese workers died, their deaths often weren't recorded or investigated. Companies simply imported more workers to replace the dead ones. The Chinese workers who built much of the Western railroad system were treated as completely disposable resources. The manipulation of land laws created massive wealth transfers from ordinary settlers to large corporations and wealthy speculators. The Homestead Act was supposed to provide free land to ordinary families, but loopholes and corrupt administration often resulted in the best land going to large corporations instead of individual homesteaders. Railroad companies received enormous government land grants that were supposed to encourage construction, but these grants often included the most valuable land along railroad routes. Companies would then sell this land to settlers at inflated prices or hold it for speculation, while homesteaders were forced onto marginal land that couldn't support families. Dummy entry systems allowed large corporations to circumvent homestead laws by paying individuals to file claims on valuable land and then transfer ownership to the corporations. Entire regions that were supposed to be available for individual homesteaders were instead consolidated into large corporate holdings through fraudulent land claims. Water rights were manipulated to concentrate control in the hands of large corporations while leaving individual farmers and ranchers without access to the water they needed for survival. Companies would file claims on entire river systems, then charge farmers and ranchers for water access or simply deny them water altogether. Banking systems on the frontier were often predatory operations designed to steal settlers' savings while providing minimal actual financial services. Many frontier banks were essentially confidence games run by people who collected deposits and then disappeared with the money. There was no federal regulation or deposit insurance, so customers had no recourse when banks failed or operators absconded with funds. Interest rates on frontier loans were often usurious, sometimes exceeding 50% annually. Farmers and ranchers desperate for capital to survive bad years would take loans at these rates, then find themselves trapped in debt cycles that they could never escape. Many families lost everything they had worked for when they couldn't meet impossible loan terms. Currency manipulation was another form of exploitation that transferred wealth from workers to corporations. Many areas lacked stable currencies, so companies issued their own money that could lose value or become worthless overnight. Workers might be paid in currency that was only accepted locally, trapping them in specific geographic areas where they could be exploited. The transportation monopoly held by railroad companies allowed them to charge whatever rates they wanted for shipping goods and people. Farmers might produce successful crops only to discover that shipping costs consumed all their profits. Railroad companies deliberately set rates to extract maximum value from agricultural production while leaving farmers barely able to survive. Grain elevator systems were designed to cheat farmers out of fair prices for their crops. Elevator operators, often working in cooperation with railroad companies, would undergrade crops or manipulate scales to pay farmers less than market value for their grain. Farmers had no alternatives because elevator companies had monopolies in most areas. Cattle buyers used their market power to manipulate prices and cheat ranchers out of fair payment for livestock. Ranchers might spend years raising cattle only to discover that buyers had colluded to keep prices artificially low. The distances involved in getting cattle to market meant that ranchers often had to accept whatever price was offered or watch their animals die. Insurance systems were often fraudulent operations that collected premiums but never paid legitimate claims. Frontier families desperate to protect their investments in crops, livestock, or buildings would pay for insurance policies that proved worthless when disaster struck. Insurance companies would find excuses to deny claims or simply disappear when large payouts were required. Supply chain manipulation allowed corporations to control both the prices that frontier producers received for their goods and the prices they paid for necessary supplies. Companies would buy agricultural products at artificially low prices, then sell manufactured goods to the same farmers at inflated prices, extracting profit from both sides of every transaction. Professional services like doctors and lawyers were often unavailable to ordinary frontier families because they were too expensive or because professionals were aligned with corporate interests. Legal representation was effectively reserved for those who could afford high fees, meaning that ordinary settlers had no recourse when they were cheated or exploited by more powerful interests. Taxation systems were often manipulated to benefit large corporations while placing disproportionate burdens on individual settlers. Railroad companies and mining corporations often paid minimal taxes despite extracting enormous wealth from frontier regions, while homesteaders and small business owners faced heavy tax burdens that made survival even more difficult. Labor organizing was violently suppressed by corporate interests that used private security forces and corrupt law enforcement to break up any attempts by workers to improve their conditions. Workers who tried to organize for better wages or safer working conditions faced blacklisting, violence, and sometimes death. The Pinkertons and other private security companies were essentially corporate armies used to terrorize workers into submission. Seasonal employment systems were designed to keep workers desperate and powerless by ensuring they never had stable income or the ability to plan for the future. Many frontier jobs were seasonal, and workers would be laid off during slow periods without any support or alternative employment opportunities. This kept wages low and prevented workers from accumulating savings or developing alternatives. Child labor was systematically exploited because children could be paid less than adults and were less likely to organize or demand better conditions. Families desperate for income would send children to work in dangerous conditions for minimal wages. Many frontier children died or were permanently disabled in industrial accidents that could have been prevented with basic safety measures. Women's labor was systematically undervalued and exploited because they had no legal rights and few alternatives for economic independence. Women did essential work in agriculture, manufacturing, and service industries, but were paid a fraction of what men received for similar work. Many women worked full-time while also managing households and raising children, providing enormous economic value for minimal compensation. Debt peonage systems trapped entire families in cycles of poverty that could last for generations. Families who fell into debt to company stores or corporate creditors found that the debt was transferred to their children, creating hereditary bondage that was difficult or impossible to escape. The boom and bust cycles that characterized frontier economic development were often artificially created by speculators who would pump up demand for particular resources or locations, then abandon them once they had extracted maximum profit. Communities that developed around these artificial booms were left with massive debts and no economic base when the speculators moved on. Corporate manipulation of government policy ensured that public resources were privatized for corporate benefit, while costs and risks were socialized among ordinary citizens. Railroad companies received massive government subsidies and land grants, but the profits went to private investors, while taxpayers bore the costs of failed projects and environmental damage. The mythology of frontier economic opportunity was deliberately created to attract workers and settlers to regions where they could be exploited more easily than in areas with established labor protections and competitive markets. The stories of people striking it rich were real, but represented tiny percentages of those who tried. For every success story, hundreds of families were destroyed by economic systems designed to benefit distant investors. Professional gamblers and confidence men followed frontier development specifically to prey on desperate people with get-rich-quick schemes and fraudulent investment opportunities. Many settlers lost their life savings to scams that promised easy wealth but delivered only financial ruin. The credit system that developed on the frontier was designed to keep farmers and ranchers perpetually indebted to banks and supply companies. Settlers would be encouraged to expand their operations using credit, then find themselves unable to repay loans when crops failed or market prices dropped. This created cycles of foreclosure and land consolidation that transferred property from individual families to large corporations. Understanding the economic exploitation that characterized frontier development helps explain why most people who moved west failed to achieve prosperity despite working under conditions that would be considered inhumane today. The system was rigged against ordinary settlers and workers, designed to extract maximum value from their labor while ensuring they remained trapped in poverty and debt. The romantic mythology of frontier economic opportunity obscured the reality that westward expansion was primarily a mechanism for transferring wealth from workers and settlers to distant capitalists who never faced the dangers or hardships of frontier life. The people who became wealthy from frontier development were typically not the ones doing the dangerous work of building settlements and extracting resources. The economic legacy of frontier exploitation created patterns of inequality and corporate dominance that influenced American economic development for generations. The concentration of wealth and power that began during frontier expansion established precedents for corporate behavior that continued long after the frontier period ended. The end of the Wild West wasn't a romantic sunset fade into history. It was a brutal collapse that revealed the true human cost of frontier expansion and left scars that persist in American society today. The transition from frontier chaos to organized society was marked by massive population die-offs, economic catastrophes, and cultural destruction that destroyed most of the communities that frontier expansion had created. The closing of the frontier, officially declared by the 1890 census, marked the end of an era that had consumed millions of lives and destroyed entire ecosystems in pursuit of wealth that mainly benefited people who never faced frontier dangers. By 1890, most of the easily accessible resources had been extracted, the best agricultural land had been claimed, and the environmental destruction was so severe that many areas could no longer support the populations that had moved there. Ghost towns across the West stand as monuments to the failure of frontier economic models. These weren't just mining camps that played out. They were entire communities that collapsed when the resources they depended on were exhausted or when economic conditions changed. Thousands of settlements that had been thriving communities became abandoned ruins within a few years of their establishment. The pattern was predictable. Speculators would identify valuable resources, promote settlement to extract those resources, then abandon the areas when the easily accessible wealth was gone. The people who had been encouraged to move to these areas were left stranded in environments that could no longer support them, often with no means to leave and no alternative sources of income. Mining towns were particularly vulnerable to sudden collapse because they were entirely dependent on mineral extraction that was inherently temporary. When ore played out or became too expensive to extract profitably, mining companies would simply abandon their operations, leaving behind toxic waste sites and unemployed populations with no other economic base. The environmental legacy of mining created long-term health disasters that affected frontier communities for generations. Mercury contamination from gold mining caused neurological damage that appeared years after exposure. Lead and arsenic from mining operations contaminated water supplies, causing cancer and other diseases that killed people decades after the mines closed. Agricultural communities faced their own forms of collapse as unsustainable farming practices depleted soil and water resources. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s was the inevitable result of agricultural techniques that had been destroying soil since the beginning of frontier expansion. Millions of acres of prairie grassland that had taken thousands of years to develop were turned into desert in just a few decades of farming. Cattle ranching created environmental destruction that made large areas uninhabitable for any kind of agriculture. Overgrazing destroyed plant communities that had stabilized soil and regulated water flow, leading to erosion and desertification that persisted long after cattle operations ended. Many areas of the West are still recovering from ecological damage caused by 19th century ranching operations. The consolidation of economic power that occurred as the frontier closed left most former frontier residents worse off than when they started. Small farmers and ranchers were squeezed out by large corporate operations that could absorb losses and manipulate markets. The independent producers who had survived the hardships of frontier life often lost their land and businesses to bank foreclosures and corporate buyouts. Railroad companies, which had been major drivers of frontier development, began consolidating their operations and abandoning unprofitable routes. Communities that had developed around railroad access found themselves isolated when service was discontinued. Without transportation connections, these communities couldn't maintain viable economies and gradually depopulated. Water rights conflicts became increasingly violent as remaining water sources became more valuable. The water appropriation systems that had developed during frontier expansion created legal frameworks that concentrated water control in the hands of large corporations and wealthy individuals. Small farmers and ranchers found themselves without water access, even in areas where they had been farming for decades. The Indian Wars that had characterized frontier expansion finally ended with the complete defeat and confinement of indigenous populations. But this victory came at enormous cost to everyone involved. The military campaigns required massive government expenditure and resulted in the destruction of entire cultures that had contained thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about sustainable living in Western environments. The massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 marked the end of indigenous resistance, but it also represented the completion of one of the most thorough genocides in human history. The indigenous population of North America had been reduced from perhaps 15 million to fewer than 250,000, and the survivors were confined to reservations that were often incapable of supporting the populations forced onto them. The boarding school system that was designed to destroy indigenous cultures created generations of traumatized individuals who couldn't fully participate in either white society or their traditional cultures. These schools produced psychological damage that affected families and communities for generations, creating cycles of dysfunction and cultural loss that persist today. Mexican-American communities that had maintained their land and cultural practices through the early frontier period found themselves increasingly marginalized as large-scale corporate agriculture replaced traditional farming methods. Anglo-legal systems and economic practices gradually displaced Hispanic cultural institutions, even in areas where Mexican-Americans had been the majority population. Chinese communities that had survived the extreme discrimination and violence of the frontier period faced new forms of exclusion as immigration laws became more restrictive and economic opportunities narrowed. The Chinese Exclusion Act and subsequent legislation created legal frameworks for systematic discrimination that lasted well into the 20th century. African Americans who had moved west, hoping to escape Southern oppression, found that frontier racism was just as virulent as what they had left behind, but with fewer legal protections and community support systems. The failure of Reconstruction in the South coincided with increasing discrimination in the West, leaving Black Americans with few places where they could achieve genuine equality or economic opportunity. The women who had demonstrated their capabilities under extreme frontier conditions found themselves increasingly confined to traditional domestic roles as communities became more established and patriarchal social structures were reinforced. Despite having proven their ability to handle any challenge frontier life presented, women were systematically excluded from political participation and economic independence. Children who had grown up on the frontier often suffered long-term psychological and physical damage from their experiences. Many frontier children never received adequate education or medical care, leaving them unprepared for the increasingly complex economic and social systems that replaced frontier communities. The high mortality rates and traumatic experiences of frontier childhood created lasting problems for entire generations. The transition from frontier chaos to organized society was often marked by violent conflicts between different groups, competing for control of remaining resources. Range wars between cattle ranchers and farmers, conflicts between large and small mining operations, and disputes over water rights created continuing violence that persisted long after the frontier was officially closed. Labor conflicts became increasingly violent as corporate power consolidated and workers attempted to organize for better conditions. The use of private security forces and government troops to break strikes and suppress labor organizing established patterns of corporate government cooperation against workers that influenced American labor relations for generations. The legal systems that developed during frontier expansion were often captured by corporate interests and used to legitimize the concentration of wealth and power that had occurred through violence and exploitation. Property rights that had been established through fraud, violence, or manipulation of corrupt legal processes became the foundation for continuing inequality and corporate dominance. Public health disasters became more apparent as frontier communities became large enough to support proper record keeping. The death rates and disease burdens that had been hidden by poor documentation during the frontier period became visible when systematic health data became available. Many frontier areas had experienced mortality rates comparable to war zones, but this had been obscured by the mythology of frontier adventure. Environmental disasters that had been building during decades of resource extraction began manifesting as large-scale ecological collapses. Deforestation led to increased flooding and erosion, overfishing depleted fish populations, and hunting pressure drove many species to extinction or near extinction. The environmental consequences of frontier expansion created long-term problems that affected entire regions. The psychological legacy of frontier trauma influenced American culture and politics long after the frontier period ended. The normalization of violence, the acceptance of exploitation, and the devaluation of community cooperation in favor of individual competition became persistent features of American society that can be traced directly to frontier experiences. Economic patterns established during frontier expansion created boom and bust cycles that became characteristic of Western development. The extraction-based economy that developed during frontier expansion made Western regions vulnerable to economic volatility that persisted well into the 20th century. Communities learned to expect economic instability and population loss as normal features of Western life. The failure of most frontier communities to achieve sustainable prosperity revealed the fundamental flaws in the economic and social models that had driven expansion. The mythology of unlimited opportunity and inevitable progress was contradicted by the reality that most frontier ventures failed and most frontier residents never achieved the prosperity they had been promised.